Most people are now aware that our governments possess advanced technology of various kinds, keeping them at an advantage over those they rule. What most people consider to be the latest technology offered to the masses may very well be the throwout of obsolete and redundant technologies from one of many secret government programs as the next generation of their technological advancements supersedes yesterday's technology. Over recent years, weather modification and geoengineering has become a topic of debate, denied by most governments as conspiratorial. Many people are growing more suspicious of their government's involvement in various projects of this nature. Was it the case that during Operation Barbarossa and the Korean War of the early 1950s that weather modification weapons were used by the Allies as a way to undermine their enemies? The German invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Barbarossa, began on the 22nd of June 1941. Their lightning war, or blitzkrieg, saw success after success, and by early October the German army was within 200 miles of Moscow. However, as they closed in on the city, their supply lines became stretched to almost breaking point, leaving some frontline forces without food, ammunition, or fuel. At this point, the Germans delayed their final push on Moscow to consolidate and strengthen their flanks. This delay allowed the Soviet forces to bolster their defenses in and around the city. Operation Typhoon was put in place, with the Germans amassing almost 2 million men for their final victory on Moscow. Although the initial phase of the plan went well, heavy rains appeared, turning the Russian landscape into a muddy quagmire, frustrating any further advance. Only 12 miles from Moscow, the temperature suddenly dropped, freezing the ground, allowing both armies a firm footing. However, this was no ordinary winter, with temperatures falling to below -40. Unprepared for such harsh conditions, the German troops almost froze to death, suffering more from frostbite and injuries due to the cold than they did from the fighting. General Raus, who was one of Germany's foremost tacticians of armoured warfare, recorded the daily mean temperature near Moscow during the first part of December 1941. Later in December, temperatures again fell to a staggering -45 degrees centigrade, with frostbite cases soaring to 800 per day. The lowest temperature recorded during the entire Russian campaign was -53 degrees centigrade, measured northwest of Moscow on the 26th of January 1942. This extreme cold weather gave the Russians the opportunity to organize a counterattack by bringing 18 elite winter divisions from Siberia to Moscow. They were able to wreck the German advance, punching massive gaps in their lines. Frozen to their weapons and frozen in the ground, the Germans became sitting ducks. The winter of 1941 to 42 is known as the coldest European winter of the 20th century, with temperatures falling far below normal for that time of year. On November the 13th, 1946, pilot Curtis Talbot, working for the General Electric Research Laboratory, climbed to an altitude of 14,000 feet, about 30 miles east of Schenectady, New York. Talbot, along with scientist Dr. Vincent Schaefer, released 3 pounds of dry ice, frozen carbon dioxide, into the clouds. As they turned south, Dr. Schaefer noted, "I looked towards the rear and was thrilled to see long streams of snow falling from the base of the cloud through which we had just passed. I shouted to Kurt to swing around, and as we did so, we passed through a mass of glistering snow crystals. Needless to say, we were quite excited. They had created the world's first human-made snowstorm." Cloud seeding is a type of weather modification that aims to change the amount or type of precipitation that falls from clouds by dispersing substances into the air that serve as cloud condensation or ice nuclei, which alter the microphysical processes within the cloud. Most common chemicals used for cloud seeding include silver iodide, potassium iodide, and dry ice. Liquid propane, which expands into a gas, has also been used, which can produce ice crystals at higher temperatures than silver iodide. Even table salt can be used. When cloud seeding takes place, when temperatures within the cloud are between -20 and -7 degrees centigrade, the introduction of a substance such as silver iodide, which has a crystalline structure similar to that of ice, will induce freezing nucleation.
What was the Frozen Army of the Korean War? Why did hundreds of Chinese soldiers suddenly die? What effect did the legendary winter cold have to play in this disaster? In June of 1950, North Korea, supported by China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. They occupied as far south as Seoul, the capital, and all the way to Busan on the coast. The United States formed a United Nations force of 16 countries to respond under the overall command of Army General Douglas MacArthur. Following the amphibious landing at Incheon, Army and Marine forces pushed the North Koreans back. Then, in conjunction with U.S. Army and British Royal Marine Commandos, the Marines managed to push the North Korean forces back across the Yalu River, the natural border with China. This was accomplished by a strategy. In October 1950, the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver Prince Smith, landed at Wonsan on the eastern side of the Korean Peninsula under the command of the Army's 10th Corps, commanded by General Edward Almond. This strategy was to drive a double envelopment and squeeze the North Koreans between two Allied forces driving north. In November 1950, with the 1st Marine Division surrounded with the chosen reservoir, he directed the breakout and subsequent 70-mile march to the seaport of Hungnam. But this was undergoing a trauma due to the November 25th declaration by the Chinese government under Mao Zedong, when 300,000 Chinese soldiers flooded in to help their North Korean allies, catching the UN forces off guard. Along the way, during what the North Koreans and Chinese call the Battle of Lake Changjin, the Allies engaged their communist opponents in brutal combat. One of these units was a blocking force responsible for cutting off the retreat of the 1st Marine Division, keeping them occupied until they could be reinforced. The North Koreans and Chinese had engaged a combined U.S. Marine and Royal Marine advance party, and a firefight ensued, forcing the Allied troops to fall back, regroup, and await reinforcements as they called in air and artillery support. But then a brutally cold wind dropped the temperatures from 0 degrees to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and Celsius in a matter of hours, and they remained at minus 40 for several weeks. The Chinese soldiers, expecting a quick victory and return home, were not properly clothed and prepared for such temperatures. Allied forces suffered terribly as well, but so did the enemy. Major General Smith's forces had reconnaissance scouts moving forward to locate the enemy. One of his regimental commanders was the legendary Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller. As the Marines pushed on, they came across a scene that was unbelievable. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers, positioned in ambush, weapons at the ready, were flash frozen solid. Some of the dead were in kneeling and standing positions. Some seemed to be running, weapons at the ready, grenades in their hands. A few moving on patrol, as if to engage an enemy, frozen like statues in the waist-deep snow. The frozen soldiers were from the 6th Company of the 117th Regiment, the 5th Company of the 242nd Regiment, and the 2nd Company of the 180th Regiment. Allied personnel also died from the severe cold, but not like this. This scenario was beyond surreal, almost unimaginable. Later, Chinese General Sung Shi-lun, commander of the 9th Corps of the Volunteer Army, reported the battle to his superiors. His telegram stated, "After the battle started, no one in the company stood up. When cleaning the battlefield, it was found that all the company's cadres and soldiers were frozen to death in a battle formation. On the battlefield, there were no signs of fighting on the scene." Another officer, General Chi Hao-chien, who had personally experienced the Battle of Changjin, recalled, "Although the Battle of Changjin Lake has been more than 60 years ago, it has been unforgettable to me."
One must now ask, how much of today's climate change emergency is genuine?